Hi everyone, welcome to the second video for week one of the sort of mini lecture series. And now we've just sort of looked at Wittgenstein's life and a bit of the module overview, but now let's sort of dive in to some of this philosophical material that we want to look at this week. So let's just begin by looking at what the Tractatus is about, right? The Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, but here mostly I'll just refer to it as the Tractatus. That's how people do it. So the first question is, what on earth is it about? When you open this book and read it, it's very, very strange in its form. It's basically a list of numbered sort of more or less cryptic remarks, statements, assertions, and not very much argument. So when you first open it, it's not altogether clear what it's even about. So let's sort of tackle that first. Well, the title, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, gives us an indication that it's about logic in some way. And it is about logic. Now, in my experience, students are sometimes a bit worried by that word logic because they've had to do sort of formal logic classes, which sometimes students don't really particularly enjoy. Formal logic classes sometimes involve, or mostly involve, sort of translating English sentences into symbols, notation, logical notation. It involves doing proofs, proving conclusions from premises given certain rules of inference, which you would have learnt on that module, etc. So you might or you might not be pleased to know that we're not going to be doing those sorts of things when we look at the Tractatus. And the Tractatus is about logic, but it doesn't involve lots of sort of doing the sorts of things that you would study in a formal logic class. So the important difference is that the Tractatus is a book in the philosophy of logic. Whereas what you do when you study a kind of formal logic class is you learn certain techniques, skills, mechanical procedures for proving theorems, etc. Right? And I think the best way to make the difference out between the philosophy of logic and doing logic is to give you an analogy with the philosophy of science. So in the philosophy of science, if you're doing philosophy of science, you're asking questions like, what is science? In what kind of activity does science consist? What kind of statements are scientific statements, right? When you're doing philosophy of science and asking those kinds of questions, you're not simultaneously doing science, necessarily, right? You're not carrying out scientific experiments when you philosophize about science. Yeah, it's a kind of second-order discipline, philosophy of science. You take a step back from scientific experimentation and you think about what is it people are doing when they do scientific experiments, right? So, in order to be a good philosopher of science, you should know something about science, of course, but you don't necessarily have to be the cutting-edge sort of quantum physicist of your era to think about science philosophically, right? So doing philosophy of science is not the same as carrying out scientific investigation. That kind of analogy holds with the Tractatus. So in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein is thinking about logic. And when we follow him, when we look at his thoughts about logic, we're not thereby doing proofs and translations and things that you may or may not have enjoyed doing in compulsory logic classes, right? So it's a bit more conceptual, it's more philosophical, it's more interesting, I think. You know, I mean, some people get a lot of satisfaction from doing proofs and such, some people don't. But in the philosophy of logic, we're not just going to be carrying out proofs, we're going to be thinking about logic. And that's what Wittgenstein was doing, right? Thinking about logic, the nature of logic, what logic is. And now the next question, I suppose, that raises is, well, what on earth is it to think about logic? I've just mentioned the philosophy of science. We can kind of understand what it is to think about science. We have this thing, this practice called science, which we're very familiar with. We read about it constantly and we're informed about it. And we kind of know what it is to think about science. You can imagine what it is to philosophize about science. It's perhaps less obvious what it is to philosophize about logic. What is logic? Right. We use the adjective logical a lot in everyday life. You go, that's logical, that's not logical. You're being illogical. We don't necessarily use the noun all the time. What is logic, as a sort of noun? So that's the sort of first question that is raised in the philosophy of logic. And it's the main question that Wittgenstein himself wants to tackle, actually. What is logic? I think if there was one question that sort of generated Wittgenstein's thinking in this period, it was what is logic? We can split that question into some other questions to make it a bit less mysterious. We can think in other terms. So Wittgenstein was also interested in asking these other questions, right? So what makes a statement which is logically true? That's a question of philosophical logic. We might have statements that we sort of intuitively think that's a matter of logic, that sentence is true. So, for instance, everything is identical to itself. Okay, that seems to be in the area of a logical truth. Okay? Everything is identical to itself. Very difficult to deny. Potentially inconceivable to deny, right? Everything is identical to itself. Seems like a logical truth. We have other sentences which are true as well, though. Like, Ollie is the instructor for the third year module on Wittgenstein, right? That's not a logical truth. So what's the difference? This is a very, very important question of philosophical logic. What does it mean for a sentence to be logically true as opposed to empirically true, contingently true, right? So that's a main question. What does it mean for a sentence to be logically true? Now, a further question that Wittgenstein is asking relatedly is sort of what are notions which are logical notions? So in the sentence, everything is identical to itself, we have I've used words there like identical and everything. These are ordinarily thought to be logical notions. So another question is, what makes those notions logical notions? And what makes a word like oak tree not obviously a logical notion, right? And these are obviously going to be related questions. Something's going to be a logical truth if it involves logical notions. But Wittgenstein wants to ask, what is a logical truth, or what does logical truth consist in? And therefore we need to ask, what are logical notions? What is it to count as a logical notion? We arrive at the subject of logic with a kind of rough intuition about what makes something a logical notion as opposed to a non-logical notion, but we don't really have a very firm definition. We just sort of go, well, that's a clear-cut case. If I give you the sentence, everything is identical to itself, and the sentence, Ollie is the instructor of this module, we can see the obvious difference there because they lie at opposite ends of the spectrum. But we don't really have a precise definition. And so Wittgenstein was interested in that kind of question. What are logical notions? What makes a truth a logical truth? And sort of relatedly, he wants to ask, what is it that logical notions mean? Now, if I give you the word identical, what does that mean? What is the meaning of that word? If I give you the name Ollie Spinney, we might say, well, the meaning of that word is me. Yeah, I'm the sort of referent. I'm the meaning. I'm what you mean when you say that word. You mean me. Identical. If I give you the word identical, it's very much less clear what the meaning of that word is, right? So we have a kind of set of questions here. What is logical truth? In what does logical truth consist? What makes a notion a logical notion? What do logical notions mean? So it's these questions that Wittgenstein is interested in. And hopefully you will sort of gather that thinking about questions like that, thinking about the philosophy of logic, is not the same as me saying, translate this sentence into these symbols and then prove this from that, right? So, in other words, I don't want you to be sort of put off by the fact that we're going to be using the word logic a lot. But these are Wittgenstein's concerns, questions like those that I've just mentioned. Now, as well as looking at those questions, which are specifically about logic, Wittgenstein also asks general questions about meaning. So a great deal of the book is devoted to a kind of account of how it is that sentences are able to have meaning. You know, this is a ridiculous phenomenon, really. You know, I can write down some scratches of ink and someone can go and build a bridge to some specifications that I've written down. You know, the sentence has a meaning. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, it's kind of outrageous that happens. You know, I'm speaking to you now, all I'm doing is moving air with my voice box, and yet you're having all these thoughts, you know, about abstract things, about the nature of logic, you know, etc. So Wittgenstein was very struck by that, right? What is it for a sentence to have meaning? This is another very central question of the Tractatus. But what I want to emphasise, and well, the first thing to say is that in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein sort of presents an account of meaning. He presents an account of logical truth, what a logical notion is, etc. But he just asserts them. And so when you read the book, it's kind of confusing because it's not clear what the relationship is between all of these different claims that Wittgenstein's making. And he'll say, the meaning of a sentence is like this, logical truth is like this. And the book is just, you know, a list of assertions. So what I want to do is to sort of help you see the connection between those assertions. So why is Wittgenstein so interested in meaning? And this is another theme that will carry on for his whole life. We'll continuously look at this notion of meaning. Well, I think it's related to those questions he was asking about logic, right? He has this question, what is logical truth? What makes a notion a logical notion? What do logical notions mean, or what do logical expressions mean? Well, asking these questions led him, I suppose slightly inevitably, to the general question, what is meaning? You can only answer the question, what do logical expressions mean, if you can answer the question, what does anything mean? Right? If I give you that logical truth again, everything is identical to itself, your only hope of finding out why it's a logical truth is to find out what it really means. And I think Wittgenstein thought that to find out what a logical truth means involves finding out what any sentence means or how sentences come to have meaning. So the Tractatus is a book which has an account of what linguistic meaning is, right? What it is for a sentence to have a meaning. And the reason he's giving that account is because in the background, hanging in the background for him, are all these questions about logic. So the direction of sort of motivation comes from thinking about logic really hard to being led into an inquiry into what meaning is. And I hope that makes sense to you. And I hope that gives you some kind of aim when you're reading the book, right? It's much easier to read this book when you know what to look for. I mean, Bertrand Russell, in the very first sentence of the introduction, actually in the third paragraph, he says, in order to understand Mr. Wittgenstein's book, it is necessary to realise what is the problem with which he is concerned. And Russell is saying that because Wittgenstein himself hasn't stated it. So it's important to see where Wittgenstein is coming from, and it's easier then to see where he's going. So he's led into an inquiry into meaning. And this is very abstract. And this is why Wittgenstein is known as one of the most famous philosophers of language. So when I say that Wittgenstein is interested in what meaning is, I don't mean that Wittgenstein is interested in merely giving the meanings of sentences. So he's not just interested in sort of translating sentences for you to go, look, that's what that sentence means. Although we do get clarification of that kind. The question is, what does meaning consist in? You know, how is it that sentences come to be meaningful at all? Very sort of abstract question. So that's I think that's bringing me to the close of this sort of mini lecture. That was just a sort of idea of what the Tractatus is about, what the motivation is, what the philosophy of logic sort of is, and how it leads Wittgenstein into an inquiry into meaning. It's all sort of fueled by this interest in philosophical logic. And he'll end up at conclusions in metaphysics, or conclusions about metaphysics and ethics and things like that. And we'll get there as well. But this is the important thing to notice at the moment. The relationship between philosophy of logic and an account of what meaningfulness is, or what is it for a sentence to be meaningful? What do sentences have to be like to be meaningful? And that, if you answer that, it will shed some light on those questions of logic. Because then you'll be in a better position to say what is it for a logical notion to be meaningful, right? That's the idea. Okay, thanks for watching this one. And in the next mini video, I will look in a bit more detail about why Wittgenstein is so interested in logic. Okay, thanks.